Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here. This is actually an auspicious day for me because it's the first anniversary of the first presentation of this speech. The occasion was Canterbury Grasshoppers, and it's a very challenging place to go and lecture. Canterbury Grasshoppers on governance, especially when it, by all accounts, it was apparent that they owned half the South Island. And if that wasn't challenging enough, I got a question from a very vocal but nonetheless distinguished guest there who questioned me and said, is it true that you're a 2016 scholar, or are you in fact a 2006 scholar that got lost in the Brazil? And are now, delivering a late report. So I thought that was a little bit unfair, but he's promised me he's not going to ask any more questions because he's here today. 2016, I don't know I can't remember 2006. 2016 was a really interesting year, and it was a year that proved the adage, you've got to hit it quite hard, don't you? And I think we've seen this today. History doesn't crawl, it leaps. And 2016 was certainly a year that history leapt. And when we started off our journey, the UK was still a part of the EU. Trump was just considered a joke. And we had amongst us a fellow called Richard Fowler who was going to go and talk about something called synthetic food, and no one really knew what that was about. And so by the end of that year, everything had changed. And it does demonstrate, and I think those themes have come through today, over the last few days, how things just don't move in a nice pattern. They bounce around all over the place, and every now and then we have these seismic shifts. And we've had seismic shifts in New Zealand, and I don't know how many of you can remember this fella. It's part of the advantage of being an older scholar is that you do remember some of these people. This guy was a real shock to the system. But what happened? It unleashed an incredible wave of innovation, an incredible wave of productivity, and probably, no one really in this room would want to go back to where he was. And so we're all aware that there's a new sheriff in town, and this guy has been pretty clear about what he wants to do, and he's pretty clear about the timeframes he wants to achieve these things. And I'm not saying this to be alarmist, but we do have to ask ourselves: are we in a position where history in New Zealand is about to leap again? And we don't know if the environmental regulation that we're facing and that we're going to face over the next 10 years is going to have as bigger or smaller or even no effect or similar effect than the economic deregulation of the 80s. But we do know that it represents change, and it represents significant change. And Jess Benseman talked about the burning platform, and some of you identify we don't know what the burning platform for change is going to be. But we do know that change is here and change is accelerating. And the reason I'm just discussing this is because my topic, agribusiness governance, is I just want at the end of the speech, if Anne gives me enough time, just to tie a little bow around it and say, well, how can governance be one of the tools that we use to manage this change? So as I reference, my topic was agribusiness governance, and so what am I talking about when I say SME or SME governance? And I think it's important to start with what I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about corporate governance, and I'm not talking about large-scale cooperative governance, and and to a large degree, I'm not even talking about the kind of industry governance, sector industry governance. It seems that everyone in this room either is, is or is about to, be involved in governance in those organisations, and there's been a lot of ink spilt. And there's a lot of research that's available, so I wanted to stay away from that quite well-trod area, and you guys amongst yourselves are probably the experts in that area. What I wanted to discuss and research and get insights into were the businesses that are at the coalface of the primary sector, and they're businesses that are defined by issues like, you cannot sack the CEO, or if you do sack the CEO, it's probably going to rip the business to bits. It's an area where you have to deal with incredibly difficult value judgments, and these can be issues of justice, issues of fairness, issues of love, and even even issues of hate. And these are not the tools that normal business and the issues that normal businesses need to deal with. It's an area where we have to think about: are we a family first business, or are we business first family? And it's an area that's absolutely, and this was proven time and time again around the world, it's an area that's absolutely dominated by what I call benevolent dictators and their husbands, and that's absolutely true. And we all know it's true. And it's a part of the great challenge. But make no mistake, I'm not talking about small businesses. I'm talking about some incredibly large businesses, both in New Zealand and certainly overseas. And they're businesses that, even though they might have professional management, they're absolutely dominated by their founders, their entrepreneurs, or their founding families. So before I say governance, the word governance for about the 30th time, we better have a quick look at the definition. And it actually comes from a Greek word which means to pilot or to steer, which sounds pretty straightforward. But it's most sort of famously described by Lord Cadbury, author of the Cadbury Report, who talks about the systems by which our companies are directed and controlled. And this was the context that I headed off into the world to think about governance and see if I could take these good principles of corporate governance that have been well trodden and well described and try and repackage them in a form that would work for the agri-SME governors. Now, in my report, I go into quite a bit of depth about, why are we even talking about governance? Because it's a pretty boring subject, and it's traditionally been quite pale, male, and stale, and we all know that. And for some reason, it's sort of become, on everyone's lips, and it's a big topic of conversation. And I won't get too far into it, but I do want to just reference Melissa's speech last night. And when she talked about those businesses that are, they hadn't failed to see disruption, but they failed to believe that they could be disrupted. When we talked about them, who did she blame? It was the directors. It was the governors. And there's the saying that success is the result of good management, and failure is the result of poor governance. And that's and we see that time and time again. And it's if there's a narrative that poor governance leads to business failure, it's emerged that there's a belief that, well, good governance must result in business success. And that's what's made governance trendy, is that everyone's trying to understand how is that governance has been seen and sold, definitely sold, by academics and consultants and no end of people for the right and wrong reasons sometimes. But it's absolutely been sold as being a panacea, as being the salvation for business and a must, an absolute compulsory part of the toolkit for business planning and things like that. And so I was probably one of those believers, and like many people who did their Nuffield experience and journey, at the end of it I probably came back with quite a different view. And I feel that governance, especially in terms of the sector that I'm talking about, has been massively overhyped and oversold. I think one of the reasons I started coming to that conclusion came around this definition, because when I was meeting with businesses and reflecting on this and thinking about Lord Cadbury's definition that governance is, is the systems by which we direct and control our companies, it just didn't seem to be a definition that fit, that rested with the people I was talking to. And I think, I probably unearthed about 30 different definitions of governance, and it was one that seemed to be quite glib and was probably quite tongue-in-cheek, that seemed to be a more accurate description of what governance tries to achieve in a business. And it's this one here, and it's that governance seeks to find a balance between tyranny and anarchy in an organisation, and it seemed to be a more relevant focus. So I want to quickly rattle through my findings here on governance, and because many of you will be familiar with the Institute of Directors' 4 pillars of governance best practice, and I think I've tended to focus around these 3 factors that I think are the major contribution governance can make for a small business. And so they are governance as a form of control, governance as a source and guider of strategy, and governance as a source of service. So I'll rip through each one in part, because I know you've all read my report, and so if this was a good meeting, I'll just take it as read and go straight to questions. But, good on the academics. There are no less than 8 theories of governance, and they call agency theory the Bible of governance theory. And agency theory deals with what we call the agency problem, which is really what happens when you separate ownership and management in a business. How do you stop managers taking off with the crown jewels? How do I stop my capital becoming the CEO's fantasy fund? And I won't labour the point, but clearly in the types of businesses that I'm talking about here, there is no separation of management and ownership. And in attempts to systemise the business through a governance lens, it's absolutely the role of management to have controls, but to replicate that through a governance focus leads to what Dr. James Lockhart calls management processes and systems on steroids masquerading as governance. And I was surprised at the number of times of people who'd felt, for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, felt that they had to sort of, take governance on belts and braces, who were actually drowning in their governance processes. And the governance process seemed to be a system to avoid having the best conversations by over-systemising it. So my view, of the three pillars of governance, it's, for agri-SMEs, strike one. The second one, so this could be a bit tricky here, because we've heard the word strategy a lot, and in the last couple of days, I haven't written down how many times we've talked mission and vision. And look, it's all good. And Winston Churchill, he said, it's a great thing to have a strategy, but every now and then you should check to see if it's working. And we all know this is true. Everyone talks about. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that actually should have moved. Everyone talks about, it's acknowledged that, that strategies don't have a long shelf life, and they do tend to fail. And they don't fail because they're not good strategies, but they fail because they're not executed. And one of the main reasons they're not executed is because of people, because, you don't get the people across the line. So when we were in Ireland and at our CSC, we were challenged with this concept that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And look, I think the guy who told us was probably a management consultant, so I was a little bit sceptical about it. And it kind of rolls off the tongue, and it was a bit glib. But it's absolutely, the more we travel and the more we see, and the more I think we reflect on our own experience, it's absolutely true. And I think my summary is I'd rather have a simple goal and a great culture and a great team, or a really fantastic strategy and no ability to deliver on it. And so I think a strategy is fantastic, and it can be good and appropriate under certain circumstances, but unless the culture of your organisation is right, I'd prioritise there. It's a nice to have, but it's not a have to have. And strategy also is an area that is steeped in agency theory. It's about the governors of an organisation, making sure that managers are heading in the right direction. So with two legs of the stool broken, I was in a little bit of trouble on my travels around the world to sort of try and prove that governance has a real role to play in agri-SMEs. And of course it absolutely does. And it does not through a thing called agency theory, it does through a thing called resource theory. And resource theory is about how does a business, through the governance function, attract the resources it needs that it hasn't got, to thrive. And when I say attract the resources, I'm talking about how does it attract the expertise? How does it attract the networks? And the networks can be networks to access capital, networks to access markets, networks to access materials. But most of all, it's probably how does an organisation attract experience? And this was really driven home to me when we were in Brazil. We met a remarkable fellow by the name of Colin Butterfield, who was a very successful agri entrepreneur. And the question I put to him was, what is the most important question a business must ask itself? And he responded emphatically. He said, the most important question a business must ask itself is, have you considered all the risks, the greatest of which is the impact of your own bias? And I think this is the issue, and this is where service comes into play, because we know we're our own worst enemies. And the role of service and governance is not to sort of bolster or add on expertise, experience and access to networks, but it's in the agri-SME context, it's absolutely to support and grow the capability of the people around the table, the people who are making the decisions and the owners. So that was my conclusion. If you're going to get stuck into governance, and it's probably not so much a message for this crowd, it's probably a message beyond this room, but if you're going to get stuck into governance, if you feel compelled to get into governance, start with service. Now I want to quickly try and wrap a bow around this, and again, I really applaud organisations that bring people in from the outside to test and challenge them. And I think we saw that last night with Melissa. It was fantastic. And my sort of lens on this is I've actually ended up doing the opposite. And because I was lucky enough to get a Nuffield scholarship, I was actually asked to go and join the dark side. And so I'm now a regulator, and I work for Hawke's Bay Regional Council, and I own the rule book. And this is the rule book that is writing freshwater policy and the changes, and all the changes that are coming around the resources you used. And like, I just really want to pay tribute to Rebecca. You know, I hope you got an A++ or whatever you get for these reports, because you described my life incredibly well in terms of collaboration process. We're 5 years and $5 million into a collaboration process in Hawke's Bay, and I think if Rebecca came through and ran her ruler over it, I don't think she'd call it a collaboration process, and I'm not sure I'd argue with her. But we have to close it out, and it's a real challenge. And I'm glad that Hugh Ritchie's on the far side of the room, because he probably want to run across and try and thump me. But because he's been sitting at the table for 5 years. But the point is that, you know, regulation is part of the change that you're facing, and there's many, many changes. And I think the forces of change are mobilising, and they're coming at you a lot. And so, what I wanted to quickly time, if Anne's going to give me time. She has to now. We no longer have the choice. We don't have any choice to avoid change. We either have to embrace change on our own terms or accept it on the terms that are delivered to us by other people. And when we're talking about other people, we cannot underestimate the power of a minority. And there's some fascinating research and commentary that's been done around the outlier impact of a minority with just a few conditions in place. And we see this in collaboration processes, and we're seeing it across all the issues that have been discussed, you know, by the scholars through the week. Minorities rule, and it's the great Achilles heel of democracy, and it's been exacerbated through through the Internet of Things and social media. So, you know, manage yourselves or be managed. Don't underestimate the value of your experience. You guys have, you know, fought and survived and won many battles you know, that you probably would have preferred not to fight. Rogernomics being one of them, and we don't know where Parkonomics or whatever it's going to be, whatever we're going to end up calling it, it's going to be. But don't underestimate the value of experience. And so my final point, when I talk about this to groups, and certainly not groups like you, is this: you know, seek the service of others. And I certainly say that to, you know, to farmers who ask me about what they should do in governance. But I think for this group, it's an entirely different message, because this is the group that's looked to help manage this industry through the incredible amounts of change that it's going to face. And so my message to you is not to seek the service of others, but lead with your service, because that is going to be the way that governance can help manage change. So thanks very much.